what could it possibly be like to actually have people whispering, did he murder his wife?
There were literally falsehoods invented. That she had gone in a car to meet Ahmed Patel, that there were two hitmen from Dubai who had checked into the same hotel. I mean, there were incredible lies being made up. One politician even claimed, he poured Russian poison into her mouth, as if he had been sitting there and witnessing at the last moments this kind of nonsense.
But living through that time, your elderly mother was accosted by a neighbor with questions about what had happened and what was your role in it.
Oh, it was worse. I mean, it was. She was. People spoke to her in the elevator of her building in Kochi, almost as if, she was the mother of a murderer, kind of thing.
I may have been born in Britain, but when I look at myself in the mirror, I see an Indian. I don't know how many people widely know, Shashi Tharoor, that you were born in England. And we'll get to that part of your life story in a moment from now.
That's where it began.
But I'm intrigued as to what it means to look at yourself in the mirror and see an Indian. What do Indians look like in the mirror?
Well, they look more like us than they do like Brits. It's as simple as that. I mean, the thing is that, look, I've actually asked myself what I meant by this. I've been saying it since I was a kid. When people, there was a time when people say, my gosh, you can actually take a British passport and you haven't. What's the matter? Why don't you? And this used to be my answer. But it's also quite simply that, we all have a sense of who we are. What constitutes that, I think, will vary according to time and circumstance. And I fully appreciate the fact that Rishi Sunak looks in the mirror, sees somebody who's more like me and you than like Duncan Cameron, but who nonetheless.
But in the age of hybrid identities, you didn't feel British Indian, you felt Indian.
Yeah, and my parents, my father went to England as a student, stayed on to work, came back to India to marry, brought his wife to England. I was born. But he never saw himself as a permanent migrant. He was looking for opportunities to come back to India. And his last job in England was heading the London office of the Statesman at a time when all the Statesman's managers in India were Englishmen. So he had to wait for an Englishman to retire before he could have a vacancy he could apply for. And that's what happened. When I was a couple of years old, he got a chance to come and be the Bombay manager. And so he happily applied, got it, popped on a ship and came back to India. So for him, that was the natural thing to do because he had gone off to England. It was just after independence, I must admit, in 48. But nonetheless, he'd gone off to England much the same spirit that Malayalis all the time are pushing off to Bombay or Delhi or Calcutta in the hope of bettering their prospects. And it was that was the spirit in which a lot of Keralites left Kerala to look for better opportunities. But they never really saw themselves as abandoning the homeland. And so I guess I just was born into that kind of mentality.
People might think that the clipped British accent is therefore an accident of birth, a consequence of being born in London.
How much do you speak at 2.5? No, I picked up my English in India, really. I mean, I think when I was a kid, I would say things like, I want to go to mummy, words to that effect, in a more British accent than I do now. But this is the English, frankly, we were taught. I went to Campion School, Bombay, where our teachers all spoke like this, and I went to St. Stephen's College, where a lot of my seniors spoke like this.
I went to college and I don't speak like you.
Well, you went after my time. My vintage was Rajiv Mehrotra, Salman Khurshid, Babu Basu. I mean, people all spoke like this. So it's not as if I was Akbar Zahir. I remember used to be one of our amateur actors. He subsequently left. But the point is that there was a large eclectic selection of voices at St. Stephen's. But this was, if you like, the typical quote-unquote Stephenian
across
accent.
the ideological trenches, Swapan Das Gupta, who went to St. Stephen's, also speaks like you.
There you are. And,
in the accent, at least.
But Chandan Mitra, who was a classmate of both of us, doesn't sound like us. So it varies. And there always were exceptions. But this was the sort of the classic Stephenian thing. And frankly, many of us spoke like this. So I wouldn't at all claim any distinctiveness, except that for some reason, the way I speak has become an issue in Indian public life, and I'm happy to wear it on my sleeve, as it were, as well as on my tongue.
But you play to the gallery also, right? I was, when I was researching for this conversation, and the attempt of our podcast Inside Out is to see if we can get to know people inside out and not ask them the usual questions that we ask them in the daily grind of journalism. And the intriguing thing is that while doing a Google search on, finding interesting things about you, I find a Quora question. And the question says, why does Shashi Tharoor use big words? And there's no actual intelligent, explicable answer to this. So why do you?
Because I'm not sure I actually do. Look, this whole thing started, as you remember, when I lost my cool with a certain unnamed, unpleasant television anchor and accused him of a farrago of distortions, misrepresentations,
he who shall not be named.
Outright lies, exactly, yes. And outright lies by a showman masquerading as a journalist, two words to that effect. The farrago is apparently what triggered it up, because suddenly in an hour's time, there was a bewildered tweet from the Oxford English Dictionary asking why suddenly, for no particular reason that they could understand, 1 million Indians were searching for the meaning of the word farrago. And they said never in the history of the Oxford English Dictionary had more than 6 or 7 people looked up this word. So they wanted to know why. And that's how this whole saga started. I remember, for whatever reason, this is a word, by the way, that I had used frequently in debates in St. Stephen's College. It wasn't exactly an unknown word, but clearly it had fallen out of common use, because the next thing I knew was that this particular word had captured various people's imagination. There was a whole bunch of accounts being opened by people calling themselves so-and-so farrago and so on, and Officer Farrago, and varying variations on those themes. I was being dubbed Mr. Farrago by others. And suddenly this became something to do with my choice of vocabulary, whereas I always prided myself on being a communicator. Mm-hmm. And if you want to communicate, you speak language that people can understand, otherwise you don't get your message across. Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, what do? I may as well, turn this to my advantage. If this is the image I'm going to be given, I'll try and make something positive out of it. So I remember not too long after we had a particular episode when a certain chief minister who had run for elections as an ally of ours turned tail or switched sides and hopped over to the dark side, as it were, in his state. So I just tweeted another large word. I wrote word of the day, snollygoster, first used 1848, definition, shrewd, unprincipled politician, latest use in India today. I didn't mention his name, I didn't mention his state, I didn't mention the circumstances, but everyone knew what I was talking about. I've been very amused since to see the word actually popping up in other people's political articles about India. So it sort of found its place. And then, of course, the crowning moment came when my publishers, as I was about to release my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, asked me to tweet about its availability. And I thought, just one more tweet about a book coming out when every author is publicizing their book is not going to make much of an impact. So why don't I play along with the same old big word thing? And I tweeted, this book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, is more than just a 400-page exercise in floxinosis nihilipilification. But I did as far as
how can you pronounce that word? Well, how many times did you have to try before you could say it? You didn't really learn this in St. Stephen's College.
I did learn it in St. Stephen's College. I swear. See, you folks are seriously underestimating all of us, because there was no television. There was one Doordarshan channel, that was it, other than a Kisan channel. Yeah. There was absolutely no other distraction, no mobile phones, no computers, no internet, no Nintendo. What do? You read or you write or you do both. And so essentially, my sort of quote-unquote extensive vocabulary comes from indiscriminate reading. And we all came on. I had plenty of people at college who would exchange banter along these lines. And floxinosis nihilipilification must have come to me from some senior.
And it means what?
It means the act of estimating something or someone as worthless. So I'm here saying, look, the book isn't just saying that the Prime Minister is worthless. I've actually got some serious analysis and readable stuff in it. Do read the book. And sure enough, the use of that word generated a huge amount of flurry of interest. And suddenly this tweet about a book got far more attention than any book announcement would otherwise have got. So it became a bit of a joke against myself that I was able to twist to a certain purpose. But honestly, whenever I go to audiences of schools or colleges, particularly schools, and people say, oh, please teach us one new word today, I say, the only word you really need to know is my favorite word. They're all looking with. I say, read. Because that's the one word you need. You read and you will acquire all the vocabulary.
Well, since I believe you're exploring millennial and Gen Z lingo, we're in the age of TLDR, too long didn't read. So it's really tough to get people to actually read, but point taken. Let's talk a little bit about your parents. You've written quite movingly about them in one of your books, and you've spoken about how you adored your father. And I think separately you've spoken about how maybe you were a tad unfair to your mother, who you thought is the sort of, the harridan, I think is the word you used. But later in life, you're walking with your father, I think in Mumbai on Marine Drive, and he's quite upset about the fact that when you were small, he believed, as perhaps all parents of his generation did, in corporal punishment, and that you got smacked a fair bit as a child.
Oh, a lot.
Yeah? What did you usually get smacked for?
Almost anything.
Like?
Dropped or spilled something, whack. Didn't do something I went told to promptly, whack.
And only your father whacked you?
Only my father.
And yet your mother is the one you call the harridan and the father is the one you adore?
It's interesting because obviously these feelings evolve. I'm sure you would ask me at different ages, I would have had different feelings. The things I adore about my father were his extraordinary capacity for love, which you don't associate typically with men, but he had an incredibly loving heart. And I know I got an enormous sign of it pretty much every day of my life with him. Second was his extraordinarily broad-minded approach to parenting, considering he's also a parent who's giving you whacks, is that, for example, when it came to crucial choices, he allowed me to follow my instincts. There were a lot of things that he directed me to. I mean, I was a bit of an introverted kid, and he was the opposite. He was a deeply extrovert man. But he insisted that to get on in life, I just needed to get away from this kid in the corner reading books all the time.
I mean, you mean as a child you were not this gregarious person sitting in front of you?
No, on the contrary, I would have this terrible habit of sitting in a corner curled up with a book at any time. I was always a reader. But that, my father sort of, for example, forced me into public speaking, elocution contests, speech contests, and debates at a very early age. In fact, I was so young that he used to write my speeches for me initially. And I would mug them up and debate. But eventually, just getting used to standing in front of an audience and commanding an audience, you learn to do things for yourself. When Pearl Padamsee, the wonderful character actress, when she started theatre classes at my school in Bombay after school hours, I was the first kid enrolled there because my dad said this will do you a lot of good. And indeed, I found a talent for acting, which I didn't know I had, and I ended up winning the Best Actor award in school. And later,
there's this classic picture of you from St. Stephen's College with Meera Nair, then in Miranda, doing what play together?
Antony and Cleopatra. She still calls me my Antony, which I know she does with a great, tongue in cheek. But anyway, the one kissing scene we had, she apparently consumed vast quantities of onions beforehand, so I wouldn't get too close. Mind you, she was a fresher, poor thing, and I was, a dreaded senior, so there was already all these gaps between us. So anyway, when I look back on all of that, for example, in the class, I just had a talent for taking exams. I kept doing ridiculously well when it came to tests. So I got admitted to the third grade in a boarding school. The one time I was sent off to boarding school when I was 5.5. So I was celebrating my 6th birthday when the kids around me were turning 8. So that didn't do me much good. I was already an asthmatic kid, and psychologically, emotionally, I just wasn't ready for this. And I had terrible asthma, spent much of my year in the infirmary. So despite being sick a lot of the time, I still managed to ace the exams, but I was sent home by the school and said, this kid is too young for boarding school. So when I went and took the entrance examinations for the 4th grade, I again aced them. But the teacher said, there's no way we're going to put a 6-year-old in the 4th grade. He'll just have to do 3rd grade again. So I had to do that, and I ended up.
So you're one of those genius types. The other kids must have hated you.
Yeah, but
did they hate you? Did the other kids hate you? No, how at that age you really feel irritated by the topper.
I suppose so, but oddly enough, I had a lot of friends both in Bombay and Calcutta, so I'm not sure that they hated me. And oddly enough, my Bombay classmates, I'm still in touch with in a WhatsApp group. I mean, it's quite amazing, all these 50 years after I left the school. But coming back to the story, so at class 9, we had to stream, so end of class 8. And I opted for humanities. And my teachers and principal were quite upset. And they summoned my parents to the school and said, this kid's our best science student. Why does he want to take humanities? And my father, being a good middle-class Kerala professional, wants his son to be a doctor or an engineer. So he said, what are you doing? Why don't you want to do this? And I said, I don't like the subject. He said, but you come first in it. And the teachers say you're their best science student. I said, Dad, I don't like the subject. I just happen to be good at taking exams. I said, I'll write the exam, but the next day I'll forget everything I've learned just for the purpose of the exam. Whereas you ask me anything on history or literature, and I'll tell you things beyond what we were required to study for the exam because I really am interested in the subject. And he was good enough to say, all right, in that case, take what you want. And once again, at the end, when I managed to get the highest marks in India at the ISC examinations, so I was all set to do what I wanted to do and do a BA degree. Again, the choice came. He said, for God's sake, do economics. You can go get an MBA afterwards, make a lot of money. What you going to do otherwise? I said, I want to do history. And again, he was broad-minded enough to let me follow And then when I finished from college, I topped Delhi University. He said, at least take the entrance exams to the IIMs. We had 2 in those days.
And you got in?
I got in first in one and second in the other.
IIM Ahmedabad and
Calcutta.
IIM Calcutta, yes.
And then I had parallelly applied to studies in things that I was interested in at American universities, and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy offered me a full scholarship to study international affairs. And so I said, I'd like to go there and do that. And he said, he was seeing this dream of his son being at least, some, fat cat executive in a Hindustanized multinational disappear before his eyes. But he again supported me in that. So
would he have been horrified that you're a politician?
Actually, oddly enough, maybe not, because he in many ways, I think, was prevented by the realities of having to earn a living from following his own instincts. He might have made a very good politician himself. First of all, he was a people person in a way that I wasn't. Second, as a 12-year-old, he organized all the kids in his village for a Quit India march during the Quit India march, and they marched around their village screaming out Quit India to the Brits. Of course, the local cops didn't take him too seriously at age 12, but that was his spirit. Third, he dropped his caste surname when he was in college because of his support for Mahatma Gandhi's anti-casteism. And in every respect, he was somebody who had ideas and views and energy, and was a kind of guy who really managed to spend time getting along with people. So he would have been better in politics than I have been.
And I do want to go back to that walk that you took with him on Marine Drive, where he's looking back and regretting his belief in corporal punishment.
He said, I didn't know any better.
He said, I didn't know any better. Because that's what his understanding of parenting was.
That's right.
But there was one exam you didn't top, and was there hell to pay for that?
There was 1 year that I didn't top, class 8.
Yes.
I think I came 3rd or something in class. And when I came home, it was like there was a death in the family. I mean, my mother could barely bear to look at me. I remember her turning away with a sort of dark cloud on her face. And my father was there. I remember lying in a darkened room wishing the sky would cave down upon me, or at least the ceiling. It's a very strange sort of thing. But that was partly, I think, my mother's drive more than my father would probably have been more indulgent or understanding in the end. But my mother she was driven throughout her life by a sort of restless discontent. And that's something which difficult to explain because she herself was not a higher academic achiever, but she expected her children to be. And she threw herself around very widely, did a lot of things, but rarely had the staying instinct to stick to it. But she had amazing talents that she never quite fully worked on enough to bring to fruition. But I think she saw her children as her way to achieve whatever she could.
So, they say that as we grow older, we become some versions of our parents. We never think we will, but we do. Speaking as a father, did you find that you became some version of your father with your twins?
I never whacked my kids, that's for sure.
Was that a reaction to what you had gone through, or was that ideological?
It was everything. It was both. It was also the fact it's just not my instinct. I'm not the kind of guy, even in school, I haven't whacked anybody or hit anybody, even if...
You've never had a fisticuff in the sandpit?
I had 1 or 2 fisticuffs, but they consisted entirely of grabbing people by the collar when they were grabbing me by the collar. But I actually haven't... My fist or hand hasn't encountered somebody else's body parts, if you want to, in violence. So it just isn't my instinct. But also my kids I remember around age 1, my twins had the habit of pulling my books off the bookshelf. So whenever I got angry and marched at them with a threatening hand, like raising my hand as if I was about to whack them, they would giggle even more uncontrollably and knock more books off the shelf. They found it so funny that their father would threaten them that after a while I started laughing too.
Have they done something that you really disagree with?
Actually, probably not. I mean, I have to give them full credit for being such outstanding kids that no, they haven't. But then that's also because I've had very, very little desire to control their lives. I've had, there's this old line of somebody who doesn't enjoy the respect he probably deserves more of. That's Khalil Gibran, who said that ultimately your kids are not yours. They're sort of a trust that you've been placed in, kind of thing, or words to that effect. And I must say that I've always felt their lives are theirs, their destiny is theirs, their fate is theirs. All you can do is guide, forewarn where possible, advise when they seek it, and pray, which I did a lot of for them. But touch wood, they seem to have done the right things by and large. And they've made their own choices. I don't think I would have wished for either of them to end up in journalism, and they both have.
Yeah, intriguing. I don't know how many people know how young you were when you actually ended up at the United Nations. But before that, before you became an international diplomat, you had dreams of joining the Indian Foreign Service. And in one of your very old interviews, I chanced upon the fact that the reason you didn't do it at the time is that you were extremely disturbed by the emergency.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
So what happened was that in 1975, I got the scholarship to go. College finished, I think, in June, if I remember right, or May, possibly. And then there was American University started in September. In those days, there weren't elaborate orientations and so on, certainly not for graduate school anyway. So I was going towards the end of August. So I had the whole summer in India, in Kolkata, where my parents were living at the time. And I was doing some theatre, amateur theatre. So I remember acting in Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap as the hero who turns out to be the villain. It's a great part. But anyway, so while
You're not supposed to give away the story.
I know.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
But for God's sake, the play's been around for 70 years. Everyone knows this. Okay, anyone who's interested in watching would have watched it by now, I hope. But anyway, so while I was doing all of this was when the emergency was declared. And needless to say, I wasn't terribly thrilled about the circumstances. Even though as president of St. Stephen's College Union the previous year, I had kept the union out of the JP movement.
Why?
Because we were a non-political union.
So one thing our college is criticized enormously for.
I know, but the truth is that we discussed it within the union, and the conclusion we came to was individuals were free to go and participate if they wanted. I myself went to listen to JP at the Gandhi Peace Foundation when he first talked about total revolution and so on. But I didn't go to any of his mass rallies because, that would have been overtly political. But I know, for example, Chandan Mitra, who was my Chancellor of the Exchequer. He went to one of the mass rallies, and I not only didn't stop him, I encouraged people to follow their own interests. But I felt it was important that the college continue its tradition of being non-political. But I also don't forget, I had been in college as a fresher in 72 when we had the notorious Delhi University strike that shut the college and the university down for 3 months. And I kind of felt those were 3 months of my young life wasted in many significant ways. I didn't particularly want to get the college dragged into that kind of politics. So in any case, I didn't. But despite the fact that I had a lot of sympathy.
And then you are in the United States of America.
No, not yet.
No,
so what happened was when the emergency declared, I'm in India. I was doing my freelance writing. I was strongly influenced by the people I knew at the Statesman, which was actually a newspaper that, rather like the Indian Express, that was very critical of the emergency. The managing director of the Statesman, Khushru Irani, I remember him coming home for a dinner or whatever, and celebrating, for example, the end of Mujib, and saying that he hoped that the Indian Prime Minister would end the same way, which shook me to the core because it really was a horrifying thought. But it was the extent of the vehemence with which many people reacted to what they saw as a suspension of Indian democracy during the emergency. So I saw all of this, and I could see why. And I had a personal experience. I had written a short story, which you can read in my collection, The $5 Smile, called The Political Murder. And it got banned. So I remember going to the Junior Statesman's office, or the JS.
Who banned it?
They had censors sitting in all publications in the first couple of weeks of the emergency. And there was this big chop applied on the editor showed me my typescript, big chop on it, saying, banned for publication or whatever by the censor, who was sitting in the office of JS Magazine. So that was, for me, kind of... But, I was at the same time sufficiently receptive to the arguments being made by Mrs. Gandhi's government at that time, that the country couldn't afford anarchy and disruption, the sort of stuff. Because at that time, our democracy was still fairly fledgling. We were trying to find out what it meant in terms of actual lives. And here was somebody, the Prime Minister, claiming should actually improve the lives of the poor. Remember, first week of the emergency, she abolished bonded labor, things like that. Talked about how politics was just completely disrupting.
So are you saying you were conflicted about
So I was conflicted in the initial days. When I went to America, I also had the additional pressure of India being attacked by Americans around me out of a fair amount of ignorance. They had no real knowledge of India. And they were sort of cliched denunciations of India's poverty, of India's quote-unquote socialism, of India's pro-Sovietism, etc. And I felt there was also a lot of ignorance. And so, like every Indian who goes abroad for the first time, my instinct was to speak up for my country. And that, in this particular case, meant defending, or at least finding some virtue. I remember saying to people, look, as somebody whose writing was banned, or one article was banned, one story was banned, I'm very conscious that the suspension of civil liberties affects people like me. But if it actually improves the life of the poor person sleeping on the sidewalk, who am I to sit in judgment?
But obviously this argument changes.
No, and it changed. That's exactly what happened. I had a roommate, fortunately, at Fletcher, who was a journalist. And so he was able to bring me copious reams of telexes of Reuters and AFP and other dispatches coming in beyond what was printed in the American papers. And so I was getting a heck of a lot of information from India, much more than I would have seen by just subscribing to newspapers in America, and of course, than I could have read in the censored press in India. And that's when my eyes opened. So in a matter of months, I began to see the emergency was doing a lot of harm, a lot of damage to India, and indeed to the very people in whose name it was proclaimed, the poor. The Turkman Gate demolitions, the vasectomy drive in which people were caught up and punished, all the sorts of horror stories we heard about the emergency were actually available to read.
Would you have been an IFS officer if it were not for the emergency, you think?
I probably would have, yeah. I mean, in the sense that I was damn good at taking exams, so I'm immodest enough to say I'd have probably aced those exams too, but I never wrote them because... the first year I would have been eligible. You needed in those days, if I remember right, to be 21. I'd gone to Fletcher at 19. So I had 2 degrees under my belt before I turned 21. But I could have. In fact, I planned to come back to India in the summer of 77. I came back in those heady months when Mrs. Gandhi had just lost the election and when there was this excitement in the air about a new revival of Indian democracy. So I could have taken the exam, but by then... I had also watched what happened during the emergency in America. I remember there was a student leader, I think his name was something like Arvind Kumar, who had spoken out against the emergency at Chicago. Then he applied for the routine renewal of his passport. And the Indian embassy said, you surrender your passport, we're sending you back home. And I thought, my God, this is a right we've all taken for granted, the right to express our views. And here we have this being done to an Indian citizen. And then I'm sorry to say I saw the then Indian ambassador, I think out of decency one shouldn't mention his name, who really had behaved almost like a propagandist for dictatorial rule during the emergency. And the moment Mrs. Gandhi was defeated, the same ambassador rushing off to hail the victory of democracy and so on. I thought, my God, if highly qualified IAS, IFS, ICS kinds of people are reduced to such pathetic imitations of human beings by the system, then is this a system I want to serve? And so I decided not to take the exam. I missed the deadline which was before the elections. I would have had to apply before the elections. So I didn't apply to take them. The elections then took place and gave us an unexpected result. And when the result came, it was partially, of course, too late to change my mind, but partially also there were changes in my life. I decided at the ripe old age of 21 to get married. And I decided to go ahead and write a PhD. And possibly explore other career options in life. And I ended up doing both of those instead.
Yeah. And then come sort of the glory years of the United Nations. Were they simpler years than your life today?
Simpler in some ways. Obviously, any sort of structured bureaucracy is more organized, but challenging in their own ways and satisfying in a very different way. I worked first 8 years for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, of which the undoubted highlight was being head of the office in Singapore at the peak of the boat people crisis, when I literally arrived in Singapore, where we not only had an overflowing refugee camp, but people were actually living in trees because there was no physical room to accommodate them. And where the UN still had a policy of being, quote unquote, non-operational. So there were no real staff to do all this. And I had to really put on the most inventive solutions that I could come up with for all sorts of problems, which brought out the best in me. I found a very creative way of financing operations that I was not supposed to be having by going to the Jesuits in Singapore and saying, I was a former Jesuit student myself, so you can do me this favor. I want you guys to sponsor somebody who nominally on paper will be working for you, but as far as the Singapore government is concerned, will be working for me, and who in fact will be working for me. And that solution gave me a camp administrator for the first time, which we needed desperately. I also found creative solutions to resettling a lot of intractable cases out of the camp, which won me some favors with the Singaporeans because they were getting incredibly frustrated with the build-up of cases and were saying that they were prepared to even change their policy and prevent people from being offloaded in Singapore if we didn't succeed in getting them out, which I did. And then I started attracting refugees from other nations who had to be handled with utmost discretion. And I solved the first Polish refugees when martial law was declared in Poland, with Polish seamen who jumped off a ship there. I solved if we have the time, I can tell you a couple of stories that were quite amazing about this period. And so I ended up, I think, growing enormously within myself, but also within the UN as somebody who could solve some interestingly challenging problems.
And of course, you run for the top job. And
that was much later. So this is the first 8.5 years. Then I go to New York and work in peacekeeping. I end up, by sheer fluke, ending up being Mr. Yugoslavia when that becomes the biggest operation the UN has ever known. And I'm sitting on top of it. It's growing under me, as it were, a huge affair. That really was sort of the making of me in terms of every major country had to notice me because they had to deal with me to follow what we were up to in peacekeeping in Yugoslavia. And then the man who had become my boss as Under Secretary General for Peacekeeping, Kofi Annan, runs for Secretary General, an idea I'm proud to say I planted in him. And I unofficially and possibly against all the rules of the UN was his discreet campaign manager. And we won. And he became Secretary General, and he insisted on, without even asking, he assumed I would come with him to the Secretary General's office. So I spent 3 or 4 years there, not as his right hand, I would say, but as one of his right fingers. The Secretary General has many right fingers. But that was a fascinating period because I saw the world from the top with the Secretary General. Tea with Tony Blair in Downing Street and vodka with Yeltsin in the Kremlin and
the glamour years.
And jasmine tea with the Chinese President Zhao Jiang in this. I've now forgotten the name of the place, the Forbidden Palace, where the Chinese leadership gathers, etc., etc. So amazing time. And when Kofi Annan was invited to meet the Pope, for example, he could take one person with him, and he took me. So I had some amazing encounters, which I'm very pleased to recall as part of the extraordinary time. And then he sort of kicked me upstairs to be Under Secretary General myself, handling what was the largest department in the organization, the Public Information Department. We had offices in 88 countries. We were tremendously under the cosh. The Americans wanted budget savings and cuts in that department. And I was able to reform it and demonstrate my credentials as a manager. And then many ambassadors came to me saying, why did you run for Secretary General when Kofi's term is up? So I had a crack at that because, of course, the Indian government had the same idea at the same time, and they backed me. At the end of the day, didn't work out, as Groucho Marx would say, close but no cigar. And my UN career ended. But if I look back on those 22 years, I have to say, 29 years, I beg your pardon, I would have to say it was 22 months of the emergency. We were talking about 29 years of the UN. I would have to say that it really was an extraordinary period of my life and something which in many ways, I think, is so completely different from the political world I've plunged into since that I can't really compare the two.
Now, in the political world, you have lived, as I guess anybody who lives in the public gaze, who has a mind of their own, who has a degree of success and recognition, who has a way with words, sometimes a way with wrong words. We all put our foot in it sometimes. You have lived under the microscope, I think almost continuously, from the time you entered politics. And one of the more bizarre allegations, I think, in your initial campaign years was that you were accused of being an Israeli agent and you had to pull out a photograph with Yasser Arafat to prove your credentials. Was that the most... was that the most absurd sort of allegation?
You know, that campaign, that was my very first campaign,
yes.
the 2009 election.
Yes.
And, people just didn't know how to do the CPM, the commies were holding that seat the two previous elections. Yeah. So I was a threat to a seat that was their seat, as it were. And I had come in as a somewhat unknown quantity, but one who had enjoyed the backing of all parties, including the CPM, when I ran for Secretary General. In fact, Prakash Karad wrote an editorial in their People's Democracy magazine, condemning the Americans for vetoing me and so on. So they would have been at a bit of a loss as to how to oppose me. The first tactic they tried was to say, look at this guy, he's suited, booted. How can he sort of represent us? He doesn't even speak proper Malayalam. How can he speak for us? All this kind of stuff. He'll have to sit in air-conditioned offices. He can't possibly be a political representative and so on. And I was able to dispel that line of campaigning by simply wearing a munda, which I'd done on previous trips to Kerala on holidays, and speaking to people in fairly simple Malayalam. My Malayalam wasn't great, but it was Malayalam picked up on annual holidays home in my childhood.
Is it better now?
And much. But anyway, and I would end up by saying, listen, as you can see, I speak enough Malayalam to understand your hopes and your needs and your problems. But more important, I speak the English and the Hindi you need to have these expressed in Delhi, which is where the job is. Speaking fine Malayalam won't get you very far with ministers and bureaucrats in Delhi. And that argument resonated very well with the voters, which left the commies looking for another line of argument. Their other line of argument was that they couldn't try me as an American capitalist stooge because they had been defending me against the Americans. So they decided I was an Israeli agent. And there were hilarious memes, James Bond movie posters modified for me as a Mossad agent and so on, because they thought this would actually appeal with both the leftist voters and with the very small but active Muslim vote. We have only about 10% Muslim population in Trivandrum parliamentary constituency, but they tend to turn out to vote. They're conscious of their civic rights. And so that was probably going to be a damn deal. So it's had some effect. I think it's estimated that the voter turnout in the Muslim areas in 2009 was very much lower than normal. But I still won the election handily by a lack of votes. In what was unusually a four-cornered contest. Because in addition to me, the communists who came second, the BJP who came third, there was also a BSP candidate who was a former Congress MP. Because people forget that in 2009, there was serious talk that Mayawati might become Prime Minister of a
I do remember that. I'm old enough to remember that.
That's right. So there you are. I won that election, but then obviously that story got very quickly dispelled because people could see who I was. They listened to me, they read me, they saw me at work. And subsequently, I'm pleased to say that the Muslim community has backed me solidly in both the two subsequent elections. And minorities generally have seen that I've been a staunch and consistent voice for what is called secularism, but I define much more as pluralism.
We'll talk about that. But, perhaps the most harrowing public scrutiny, public commentary was after the death of your wife, Sunanda Pushkar. And it was not something I think you could ever have imagined that you and murder would be spoken of in the same sentence.
You can imagine.
It took many years before the story, the charge of murder shifted to abetment to suicide. It would be a long time before a Delhi court actually said, we drop all charges. I want to ask you today, with the benefit of some distance, to tell our audience, what could it possibly be like to actually have people whispering, did he murder his wife?
Yeah, it's absolutely incredible, Barkha. I was initially in a state of shock, first of all, about a young and vibrant personality disappearing like that. So there was already that shock to be absorbed. And then there were these incredible stories. It started apparently with a TV show within 2 days of her death on one of the Hindi channels, which somebody watched and talked about. And it just continued to snowball as certain very malicious individuals, for their own reasons, which they will have to figure out, started embellishing these conspiracy theories with blatant lies. There were literally falsehoods invented. That she had gone in a car to meet Ahmed Patel, that there were two hitmen from Dubai who had checked into the same hotel. I mean, there were incredible lies being made up. One politician even claimed, he poured Russian poison into her mouth, as if he had been sitting there and witnessing at the last moments, this kind of nonsense. And, I was strengthened by only two things. First of all, my own conscience, because I knew that I had done none of these things. But secondly, by the fact that Sunanda's family stood by me throughout. Both her brothers and her son knew the reality of my relationship with her, from good and from bad. They knew my qualities as a human being, and none of them at any point expressed any doubts or any misgivings. They didn't play along with any of these attempts by the media to persecute me. And since I was cooperating fully with the police, I encouraged them to do the same, share any misgivings they might have had. They didn't have any, but they spoke to the police fully, as did I. And, it became very clear after a while that whatever the motivations for this ongoing harassment were, they had much more to do with politics and much less to do with any actual
But living through that time, your elderly mother was accosted by a neighbor with questions about what had happened and what was your role in it.
Oh, it was worse. I mean, it was, she was, people spoke to her in the elevator of her building in Kochi almost as if, she was the mother of a murderer kind of thing. And for a mother who, as it is, had felt that my achievements were good but not enough to satisfy her, you can imagine how shattered she was by all of this. And it was hard. It was really,
and
really
you,
hard.
How did you function? Because there is a certain, I would say, operational efficiency to you. Maybe that comes from decades of training in the United Nations. But, no global crisis could have prepared you for actually being accused of murder.
For something as intensely personal as this, because it really was essential for me to take stock of myself. And it took a while to just say, listen, don't let them define who you are. You know who you are. If you've really done something evil and were trying to hide it, you'd be a disaster at it because your conscience wouldn't let you. But since you've done nothing wrong, why should you let them determine how you will appear? And I remembered a line that Kofi Annan had told me when he was unfairly attacked during the so-called oil for food scandal in the United Nations. He said his father had taught him a Ghanaian proverb. So when the sharks bite you, do not bleed. And I said, Kofi, I don't understand. I mean, surely when the sharks bite you, you will bleed. And he said, one day you will understand. So I had thought about it and fully quite got the message. But when this happened, it suddenly came to me in a blinding flash. You can't give the sharks the satisfaction of knowing you're bleeding, because that's what they want. When they're biting you, they're doing it for their pleasure, for their satisfaction, for their greed, for their TRPs or their political votes, or whatever their agenda may be. If you suffer, you're actually enabling them. And that realization helped me to just completely act as if they didn't exist, to just go ahead, ignore them. It was also the advice of my lawyers not to react, not to respond, and not to sue. So I didn't. I just did my work, wrote my books, made my speeches, and began allowing others to see me in other contexts. So, for example, that speech that became my best-known speech ever at the Oxford Union was in the summer of 2015, just a year and a half after Sunanda's death, when this was still the dominant trope about me. And I think it did help change a lot of people's perceptions as to who I was, when the Prime Minister himself said this was the right thing to say at the right place at the right time. Now, that kind of stuff would not be said about somebody whom they really believed was guilty of murder. The sort of rather desperate search for evidence and the inability to find any was also becoming fairly evident. And one or two journalists were beginning to realize this and were beginning to say so to me, though none somehow found it expedient to run a story pointing out to all the holes in the conspiracy theory against me. But anyway, I stuck it out. we were told by various people that their friends in the police had told them that the police had essentially given up on the investigation because there wasn't a shred of evidence to support any charge, and that the file was sitting with the police commissioner for closure. But after a year and a half of being in limbo like that, suddenly out of the blue, and predictably the year before the 2019 election, suddenly the police go and file a charge sheet alleging abetment to suicide. So even though the active investigation, the interrogations, all that was completely over a year and a half earlier, and we had been told the whole thing would be, not by the police officially, but by people who claim to have excellent sources. And there were too many different people saying this for us not to believe it. We had genuinely thought it was just a question of them finding a propitious moment to close the file. Instead, they decided to throw it before the courts. So then we had to go through the process of arguing. But fortunately, that process went well. I had an excellent lawyer in Vikas Pahwa, his assistant Gaurav Gupta and others, and a courageous judge who didn't allow herself to be intimidated
But while all of this was happening, and of course, as you said, your mother was being treated as the mother of a murderer by some neighbors in her building. Suddenly, your entire life, not just your life with Sunanda, but your personal life prior to that, your marriages prior to that, your divorces prior to that, your relationships were up for drawing room gossip. Everybody was speculating, talking, whispering. And of course, in a city like Delhi, in a country like India, it all gets back to you. How did you deal with that? Because I think public figures are trained to deal with many things, but when your own life, in particular who you've loved, who you've been with, is deconstructed, how did you deal with that?
With difficulty. I mean, part of it, frankly, Barkha, is to follow the simple rule that I've tended to follow every time in life, even before all of this happened, which is to take people only at face value. In other words, you may hear that somebody who you think is a friend has been bitching about you behind your back. But since you haven't seen it firsthand, you owe it to yourself to behave with that person as their behavior to you would warrant.
Yeah.
Now, when they behave badly, then you step aside. But when they're behaving directly to your face in a friendly manner, for you to be churlish in return is not right. So with the same logic, I knew that some of the people who were inviting me home or calling me to parties or praising me on stages were going around as soon as my back was turned and whispering behind me. I knew because people were saying that they were.
Yeah.
But as long as I didn't have first-hand evidence of it, I refused to behave accordingly. And that was wise because a lot of these people subsequently have come around and I've had to live and work with them. So I can't possibly have just built up a large cupboard full of enemies. The second thing, as I said, was to lose myself in work. So knowing, particularly in those first couple of years, that a lot of the social engagements were just poison pools, I would make a token appearance to show I wasn't afraid and nothing to hide, but I would rarely linger long enough. I'd go back, get back to my computer and do my work. I wasn't sitting around partying and being a social animal, which Sunanda had been, and along with her, I had become very much, there was a danger of being typecast as a page 3 politician, which wasn't my style naturally. And so I went back to being my natural self, which was to read and write a lot more. And as a result, some of my most productive years as a writer happened when I was under the cosh for these false charges.
Has all of this scarred you for love?
I don't know. I suppose it makes you a little bit more cynical, but there's something sort of, about my what can I say, my hopeless naivety about human beings that even my political allies sometimes despair of me. That it's almost too easy to win me back, as it were, to hopeless causes.
So are you saying you're still a romantic in your 60s?
Well, I'm fortunately probably getting too old for romance in any meaningful sense of the term, but I'm certainly capable of it.
Well, that is, I think that would interest a number of people in our audience. In the end, we have a few minutes left. I want to talk about what kind of liberalism you identify with. You mentioned earlier that you would no longer use the word secular. It's become a corroded sort of word. It doesn't mean that you have any, let me preface this by saying it doesn't mean you don't believe in pluralism.
I do, very passionately.
Yes, so I'm just underlining that. But I think in different ways, all of us who come from a certain socioeconomic privilege, who have been insulated, who have been somewhat in some ivory towers, even those of us who are from middle class backgrounds, we've had to learn as we get exposed to real life in a world outside, that maybe the language we have to express our liberal progressive thoughts in is not a language that a lot of people understand. We have to learn a new language. For instance, you wrote a book on why you identify as a Hindu. A few decades ago, you may not have identified as that. I have, staunchly left religion and caste columns empty, but I recognize, at least in the caste context, it's my privilege that allows me to leave that column empty. Right?
True. And I haven't left those columns empty for one simple reason, that I actually have been saying this before. In fact, as I pointed out when I wrote Why I'm a Hindu in 2018, I had actually said in 3 pages of India from Midnight to the Millennium what I said over 300 pages in Why I'm a Hindu 20 years later. Because in the era when I wrote India from Midnight to the Millennium, it didn't seem to me necessary to belabor the point. I just wrote it in order to explain the context from which I was attacking the people who demolished the Babri Masjid and who were leading the Ram Janmabhoomi cause and so on, as to what was wrong with them. I was speaking as a believing Hindu, and I wasn't attacking them purely as a sort of godless secularist, as many people would have assumed that I might have been. So yes, I've been consistent in my espousal of Hindu faith, something I grew up with, but I have an understanding of Hindu faith, which is my parents' understanding as well, that it's one that absolutely believes in acceptance of other people's different ways of living and being, and that doesn't judge them. In fact, in my life, I have never tended to be someone who judges people. I accept people as they are, and I accept their right to be who they are, to live as they want, as long as they don't harm others in the process. So somebody is gay, that's their issue. Somebody is, RSS, that's their issue. Somebody is, a bearded Muslim, that's their issue. Somebody is an agnostic, that's their issue. As far as I'm concerned, they're all human beings. Judge them for who they are. Judge them, if you relate to them, rather, not judge them. Relate to them for who they are and how they relate to you. As long as they don't harm you and they don't harm others, let them be who they are. Let them be and become who they want to be. That's been my philosophy of daily life.
Has politics
and translated
changed?
Into politics.
Yeah, has politics changed?
On the contrary, politics is a daily reminder of our diversity. There's so many different kinds of people. If I didn't accept them all for who they are, I would not be able to survive in politics. And that's why I find political intolerance that much more difficult to swallow, because the very people who are behaving like this are living in a society where they're meeting lots of people who don't conform to their stereotypes.
Do you have in your lived life thus far any serious regrets?
Oh, of course.
No, I don't mean, I wish I had taken that exam. I wish I'd met so-and-so. Something deep that haunts you.
Yeah, I think frankly, if I hadn't been living in America, would I have actually initiated my divorce with my wife, my college sweetheart, somebody we've been together with for 22 years.
This is your first divorce?
My first divorce, yeah. That in many ways has been a cause of much painful introspection for many years. And the truth is that I think in America it was easier in that slightly more atomized society to think that I won't live a lie. I'm going to be myself and do what is right for me and so on. Whereas in India, with the buffer of family, society, cultural practices, many people who are having difficulties in their marriage tend to say, we'll work it through, and there's lots of support systems to keep us going. And that's true even a generation later. My divorce was 1999, so we are talking about a generation later. There's still relatively few divorces in India because society works, if you like, conspires to keep families together. So that's something that I've regretted. I've never believed that the people who say they go through life without regrets are genuinely being honest, because I think that the unexamined life is one that's not worth living. If you've lived a life that's full of incident and of thought and of action, you honestly have had occasion to look back on it at various times, small and big, including the small things you mentioned. Wish I'd done this, wish I'd done that, wish I'd not said this, wish I'd said that. But those kinds of regrets everyone should have. But also, I think the big things in life. I've also learned to live with failures.
What has been your biggest? What do you identify as your biggest failure?
Well, the biggest failures have clearly been, number one, the loss of the Secretary General's race. Because when I ran there, I must say that I almost allowed myself to believe that my entire professional life had been a preparation for that. I was literally the only candidate ever who had done every one of the key roles and therefore was familiar with everything that a Secretary General needed to do. I'd done humanitarian, I'd done political, I'd done Security Council, I'd done peacekeeping, I'd done public information, I'd done management. I mean, there wouldn't have been a better prepared Secretary General. So suddenly I gave myself the illusion, boy, I'm the right person for this job. It took me a while to realize that actually this is not a job that comes according to your resume. It comes on the basis of
welcome to the
decision.
real world. Yeah.
And the Americans had made their minds up, no more Kofis, by which they meant nobody who was capable of articulating a point of view that could take them above the heads of governments to appeal to the world public, as Kofi had successfully done. They wanted somebody who would listen to them and be a good conforming servant of governments. And I must say, it was a very healthy lesson in realizing the old cliche that life isn't always fair, nor are political elections.
Well, think of it like this. If you had won that election, you may not have been here as a 3-time member of parliament for Thiruvananthapuram. So, they say destiny, God, fate, what have you, has a plan. Before we say goodbye and thank you to you, tell us about a new word that you've learned that would best describe your current state of mind.
Oh, it's not necessarily a new word. I think a very, very old word. Uncertain, I think, in many ways, about many things.
What are you uncertain about? That's tantalizingly interesting. What are you uncertain about?
Oh, I'm uncertain about my own future, for one thing.
Political future?
Everything, yeah. I mean, I've done 3 terms.
Spell that out.
Do I want to contest again for a 4th term? Do I believe that I have what the Americans call the fire in the belly to do justice to a 4th term? If I do I believe that the current role that I've had over the course of my 3rd term is worth repeating in the 4th? These are all questions I have to ask myself.
Could you be looking for a major political... This conversation is not meant to be about news. It's not a news interview. But the journalist in me, that itch has been scratched, and I have to ask you. There is some sense that after you ran for the post of Congress president, you lost that post. Your national profile definitely increased, but you haven't necessarily been treated the best by your party. There's a lot of speculation that you may leave the Congress. Could that happen?
Look, I'm not contemplating that at the moment because I genuinely believe that the one party with which I'm most in sync in terms of convictions, values, style, and so on is the Congress. In many ways, I find myself instinctively articulating things which happen to be precisely the same things that the Congress spokesman does sometimes a couple of hours later. It's not as if I've taken a party line and followed it. We just think along those lines and many of the key issues facing the country. So it's not that. I mean, I don't really have anything particularly uncongressy, as it were, about my values, and possibly within the Congress party.
But are you hurt?
I'm more to the right of centre on economics, that is, along with the Montakes and Chidambarams and Manmohan Singhs, rather than with the more left of centre economics that many of my colleagues practice. But the Congress has been a big enough tent to accommodate both sets of views. And I think we need people who are pro-business in the party, just as we need people who are pro, shall we say, more state control. As long as both sets of people believe in social justice, we end up in the same place, and we do. So all of this, I have much more in common, as it were, with the Congress school of thought than with any other school of thought. And that's something that will keep me. But, the real question to ask is that, do I have to remain in politics? I mean, that's the
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that at some point, and certainly I hope before I'm, carried off to my eternal rest, that I will actually enjoy and deserve a life in which I can give my full attention to the writing that's always meant so much to me.
Are you actually considering leaving politics?
I'm not considering anything right now. I've got a full year of my term left, Barkha. Don't make news in this kind of conversation. But I think the time may come when I have to sort of make some decisions. Sure. And it may well be just to continue what I'm doing. So let's not. But I'm just saying that there's a lot more to life than what I'm doing right now.
So let's end with that word of the day, uncertain. It also leaves the door open for new things to happen, for different things to happen. And that always keeps things interesting. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Shashi, on this podcast, Inside Out, where we hope to get to the person behind the persona. I hope our audience has learned something new and different about you than the usual political questions. I apologize for the last two because I couldn't resist my sort of second skin, which is to be a news reporter. But mostly, I think we stepped back from that. So thank you, Shashi. Pleasure.
Thanks so much, Barkha. Great pleasure.